Here, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to the 2009 Samuel Dash Conference on Human Rights. This program every year that we present has really become a mainstay of our human rights program at Georgetown. We're delighted to put it on every year, and every year it's different with new ideas and new thoughts, and I really want to welcome all the members of the military services here. It's great to see you here at Georgetown, and this is really a very exciting program. The Dash Conference was a gift and endowment by the Dash family in honor of Sam Dash, our colleague, our mentor, our teacher, our friend, a member of this community for many, many years who had a distinguished career in the classroom, in public service, and working on human rights issues. I wanted to acknowledge in the front row members of the Dash family, Sarah Dash, Sam's wife of many, many years, and daughters Judy and Rachel. Thank you all for being here this morning. I'm also pleased to announce the creation of the Samuel Dash Endowed Scholarship that was just created here at Georgetown this year. The scholarship will be awarded to Georgetown law students with demonstrated need, with preference for students who excel in professional responsibility, criminal law and procedure, or human rights law courses. The scholarship is really a lovely permanent tribute to Sam. And we are delighted to be able to have it here now. And as by mentioning professional responsibility, criminal law and procedure, and human rights, you get a sense of the scope of Sam Dash's interests and his contributions, again, to this law school and to the legal profession as a whole. So welcome to the Dash Conference. Today's topics are fascinating. We're going to get right to it. I just wanted to mention one other fact which people may not know. There's a long description of Sam and his many activities in your materials, but we also learned this morning that Sam had taught at the JAG School, which is something I didn't know about him. So would have been very pleased with this program. It's a terrific program on a very important set of issues. And lastly, before we start, I do want to thank Rachel Taylor, the Deputy Director of our Human Rights Institute, who has put all this together, made this all possible. Rachel, thank you so much. And with that, I'll turn things over to General Chipman.
Thank you, Dean. And on behalf of Lieutenant General Scott Black, our Judge Advocate General for the Army, I'd like to welcome all of you here from the Army's side. And I see we've got colleagues in Mufti and colleagues throughout the armed services here with us today. We'd like to thank Georgetown, first of all, for hosting this event and for the exceptional support we've been provided. From the Legal Center and School, I'd like to thank in particular Marie Anderson, Major Marie Anderson, who sat in my office on Monday afternoon with the deer in the headlight look, with that panic-stricken look that only someone in the throes of conference organizing can have. But we knew it would all come together, Marie, and in fact it has. We're excited to participate in this effort. I look back at the inaugural, what I think from our perspective, Rule of Law Conference was back in September of 2006, I think. When we partnered with the Carr Center and tried to start some of this discussion. And since then, I think we have moved the ball forward in a significant way, and I think we continue to do so with these type of fora. We're blessed in Charlottesville to have with us as well Tom Nachbar, who, when he doesn't teach with UVA, lends his support and able intellect to the JAG School as well. So we're happy to be part of this event. We thank you all for your attendance and look forward to a great day. Thank you.
So good morning. I'm Tom Nachbar from the University of Virginia. And on behalf of the University of Virginia, I'd like to welcome you all to this year's DASH Conference on Human Rights. It's a delight to see so many faces, both familiar and new. This conference is a particularly gratifying event for me because it's brought together three institutions, Georgetown, the JAG School, and UVA, with which I have at least some connection. My connection to UVA is obvious. I'm also fortunate enough to do my reserve military service at the JAG School in Charlottesville, which is very conveniently located for me across the parking lot from the University of Virginia School of Law. But it's also a very happy occasion to give me a chance to work with my unfortunately former colleague, Rosa here at Georgetown. Georgetown, rarely do I get a chance to work with so many of my favorite people from these three different institutions at the same time. Conferences like this can't take place without a huge amount of organizational effort that is not going to be apparent to you because it was so good. In particular, I'd like to thank Major Marie Anderson at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School, Rachel Taylor here at the Human Rights Institute, and Jessica Shao and the event staff at Georgetown, who have all done a beautiful job of bringing together speakers from all over the country for what I think is going to be just a wonderful conference. I'd also like to thank the DASH family for their really incredible support for the DASH conference. And conferences like this can't happen without that kind of support and your support, and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. I'm not done thanking people because I would like to extend a special thanks to Georgetown, to the Law Center itself for hosting the conference. We have any number of wonderful conferences at UVA every year, but the one thing that we would have had a hard time bringing to this conference if we'd held it in Charlottesville would be you, the audience. By virtue of its willingness to host the conference here at Georgetown, it's allowed us to draw in a great deal of practitioners who are actually doing this work day to day. And so for that, I and the university are very grateful to Dean Aleinikoff and Georgetown. Our location here is doubly advantageous because it's allowed us to organize a working group session that will take place tomorrow that's going to bring together a group of subject matter experts from the military, civilian, and governmental and non-governmental spheres, along maybe with an academic or two, to address a concrete problem in the rule of law. And our hope is that we'll be able to both educate each other about how to take a holistic approach to these projects while simultaneously developing some new tools that both practitioners and academics can use when thinking about these problems. Just as this conference represents an opportunity for these three institutions to come together, it also brings together people from many different organizations who are engaged in the enterprise of helping to establish the rule of law in the context of substantial military intervention. The conference itself will be a resounding success if it does no more than opens up a dialogue on these issues. As it happens, that kind of dialogue, although acknowledged to be necessary, is hard to engage in. There are very few things, I think, that everyone who works in this area can agree upon when it comes to programs helped to establish or reestablish the rule of law in the context of major military interventions such as are taking place in Afghanistan and Iraq. Perhaps the only universal truth in the field is that we've decided to call rule of law is that actually bringing about the kind of changes that we think are represented by the term in failed or failing states is very, very hard, which is not necessarily the best point on which to agree. Another widely held belief, though, is that any approach to the rule of law has got to be a coordinated one, involving both civilian and, in the context of a military intervention, military resources. And that, I think, is pretty much where the agreement ends. Some of the agreement, or the disagreement rather, is explicit and represents different theories and ideas about how things like the security environment affect your ability to engage in capacity building projects like these. Some, for instance, might view rule of law as a means to security, while others might view security as a means to rule of law. Some of the disagreement, though, is not so much expressed disagreement as it is implicit disagreement that's represented by the widely divergent cultures present in the very different types of organizations who necessarily have to come together to engage in these kinds of projects. So imagine, if you will, a foreign service officer who finds that he's going to go undertake a rule of law mission and seeks out a friend who's a military officer who just returned from doing a rule of law mission for advice about how to do it. Without considerable sensitivity to their divergent backgrounds, the military officer could very well explain the program using doctrine and procedures that the Foreign Service officer really has no familiarity with, and potentially in a language virtually incomprehensible to them. I don't want to overemphasize, though, the split between military and civilian approaches to rule of law. There's substantial disagreement among civilian agencies and among the services and within the services. It would be a rabid oversimplification to suggest that there is one military understanding of the rule of law and one civilian one, and I think that fact will be borne out by the panelists that we have here today. There's also, I think, largely widespread agreement that civilian agencies should take the lead in these projects, but there's a question about what to do when a security situation deteriorates in a host nation to the extent that U.S. military intervention is deemed necessary. In such cases, the U.S. response is likely going to be dominated by the military. So if what is viewed as the optimal approach, civilian lead, is impractical simply because civilians cannot operate in the environment, what then? The Department of Defense is engaged in shifting its doctrine right now to make capacity building under the rubric of stability operations a core mission on par with combat operations. At the same time, there's a major plan on the civilian agency side to grow a stronger deployable civilian response capability. And, of course, there are existing government and non-governmental programs, all with different approaches. Like many rule of law programs themselves, however, the ambitions underlying these plans remain largely unrealized. Moreover, it's yet to be seen what such large-scale changes in how we approach the problem will have on the problem itself. How do such rapid changes affect the institutions at which they're directed? Are civilian agencies interchangeable? Is the need to grow civilian capacity so quickly going to require an influx of contractors, for instance, right? And what implications does that have for how we undertake these projects? Are civilian and military approaches to instilling the rule of law even compatible? And even if they're superficially compatible, right, does heavy involvement by the military in undertaking rule of law projects necessarily alter the nature of the rule of law for those countries whose exposure to it is at the hands of a foreign military power rather than at the hands of civilian aid workers or, even more differently, indigenous resources? Hopefully, today, we will address, if not necessarily resolve, these questions and others. The conference today, our panels are organized from the ground up. Our first panel will discuss operations actually taking place on the ground and how the organizations engaged in those operations work together in order to do them. The second panel will address questions about how different institutions bring different approaches and how they can work best together in order to engage in these operations. The third panel will operate at an even more abstract level, discussing strategies and approaches for thinking about the problem itself. Our panels will be punctuated by talks by two individuals, Tom Ricks and Jay Johnson, both of which have much to offer on the topic. So we're fortunate to have excellent panels and speakers. So without further ado, let's get to them.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Major Marie Anderson, and for the panel this morning, we're going to have each of our panelists have 10 minutes to give a presentation, and then I ask that you hold your questions so that all of the panelists have time to get through their initial presentations, and then after they're done, we'll take questions from the floor. And we will begin with Colonel Paschal.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to address you this morning. I've just finished command of the 1st Brigade Combat Team, and we spent 15 months in Iraq. And one of the areas that I'm most proud of our achievements there was in the non-kinetic lines of operation. And we were able to do that because we had achieved an appropriate level of security. If you go to the next slide, please. The Brigade Combat Team is composed of about 3,800 soldiers under my command. One of our key relationships, though, was our partnership with the Provincial Reconstruction Team, and the Iraqi leadership within the Kirkuk province. I was in Kirkuk. You could see the 10th Mountain Division right there. We were assigned to the Multinational Division North, commanded by a general officer out of Germany. Our area of operations was roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island, about 220 kilometers by about 250 kilometers. So I talked about that key partnership and relationship with the provincial reconstruction team, which really was composed of about 64 individuals. About 40 of those were career Foreign Service officers or contractors, and the remainder were civil affairs officers. Next slide. This is my mission statement while we were there, and I'm not going to bore you with the details of it because we talk about counterinsurgency operations and defeat, but what I wrap it up is we had to address the political, the social, and the economic means that were fueling the insurgency. What makes a young man, and then towards the end of our rotation, a young woman willing to strap on a bomb and walk into a crowded marketplace and blow themselves up? I think we realize that the military can only provide the security for the other elements of national power to affect those areas. Slide. These are, while we were still in the States, we developed a campaign plan. We knew we would be in Iraq for about 15 months. My initial focus was the bottom. As you look at the chart there, I am the third from the right where you see the Warrior Brigade combat team. My initial focus was going to be on security operations. So we created a campaign plan and a strategy to work under each of those lines of operation. But we only completed it to about the 75th percentile because we knew we had to get into country, do an assessment with our predecessors, the unit on the ground, to see how far they had been able to achieve their operations. But more importantly, we wanted to sit down with the provincial reconstruction team and work together to establish a joint interagency campaign plan. Initially, the rule of law we had wrapped up under the governance line of operation. Because of the successes in the security arena and the successes that we began to achieve under the rule of law, we broke that out and established it as a separate line of operation. Next slide. I talked about our partnership, and this was the most critical relationship we had with the provincial reconstruction team. As we got into theater, we sat down and we established a level of working groups with our counterparts in the provincial reconstruction team. In the rule of law, we were very fortunate. One of the civil affairs officers was a civilian attorney that was assigned to the provincial reconstruction team, and then Miss Rebecca Stanton from the Department of Justice was assigned there. So together, once we were able to establish the rule of law as a line of operation and partner with the provincial reconstruction team, we formed this working group that was going to focus on the way ahead. But we quickly realized that it was larger than the BCT, larger than the PRT. We had to integrate the international police trainers, and then more importantly, how are we going to interact with our Iraqi counterparts? What I'll do now is just highlight a couple of our successes or initiatives that we had tried there. When I first arrived in the theater, they had traveling judges from Baghdad would move throughout the provinces because of security operations, and they would try the criminals. They had to try them on an Iraqi army base. While we were there the first month, they came forward and had 25 hearings. They assigned a new chief judge to the Kirkuk province who wanted to move from and we encouraged him to move from the traveling judges to the local judges hearing the cases. The concerns with the local judges hearing the cases was fear for their own security. And they were easily intimidated. Not that they weren't good judges, but they were easily intimidated. Their families were threatened. So the first time they had the cases, they heard their cases on the Iraqi army base. That was a success. Our next step forward, and our largest success, was they moved when Judge Nauman, the chief judge, said, I would like to hear the cases in the courthouse downtown. which was a huge success, and that opened it up. When you had the cases, once we tried them on the Iraqi Army base, the initiatives, the ability of the family members, the press, and defense attorneys to provide access to their clients was difficult. So this was a huge success, and we encouraged them to move forward along this line. Colonel Martins is here in the crowd, and he was a big success in helping us solve this initiative here with the Suli, what we refer to as the Sulaymaniyah 229. Kirkuk is predominantly Kurdish, and they have the ASAH, which is a paramilitary/intelligence wing that works for the political parties. During the early years of the invasion, or after the invasion, they were operating in and about Kirkuk freely. And because of their distrust of the Iraqi system, were bringing their detainees up to Sulaymaniyah, which is part of the Kurdistan regional government. When we arrived, there were detainees that had been in custody for upwards of 5 years that had not seen any legal representation or seen a judge. The Provincial Reconstruction Team had been working this problem for about a year. Based through our partnership and our ability to tap into MNCI, we were able to get some movement, and actually many of these cases were heard. About 150 were released under the amnesty program. You can see that there in the lower right. Those are individuals that had been held rejoining their families. But it was 9 months of hard work and effort to make this occur. And part of the Iraqi law, you have to be tried in the province that you are detained in. Well, once they were moved from Kirkuk to Sulaymaniyah, the Sulaymaniyah judges were unable to review the cases. We wanted to get them back to Kirkuk. Kirkuk judges refused to hear the cases because the ASAH was not a legal authority to detain them. So there were many hoops that we had to jump through, but I'm proud to say that 229 individuals have been reunited with their families. And I mentioned Colonel Martins because he was at MNCI and was instrumental in dealing with the Chief Judge of Iraq to provide the orders and the initiatives for the local judges to solve the problem. A spinoff of our Rule of Law Working Group was the criminal justice councils that we established with our Iraqi counterparts. We had very good working relationships with the chief judge and the chief investigative judge, but our partnership with the police and the Iraqi army was just as important. We had initial meetings that we hosted, and really that was just to open up the dialogue between the police and the judges. There was a lot of finger pointing going on in between each other, and this was an opportunity for them to get into the room and to dialogue. Again, successes as they began to build on this program. They hosted the next 2 and 3 meetings, and we moved from just initial dialogue to evidence collection, evidentiary procedures. There was dialogue between the judges and the police that coerced confessions were not going to be accepted. Often that was the only evidence that they'd had was coerced confessions. And the police were frustrated because their cases were being thrown out, and the Iraqi judges were frustrated because there was terrible evidence. But this was an opportunity for them to dialogue amongst each other in a way ahead for them to solve their own problems. We were very fortunate. This is General Jamal, who is a classically trained policeman. He's a lawyer by trade. So the difference between Kirkuk and many of the other provinces that the police chief was a former Iraqi army officer who approached things in a military manner. We were very fortunate, and General Jamal approached things in a police manner. And our goal in dealing with him during the 15 months was to move from a paramilitary gendarmerie fighting terrorists into a community-based policing organization. They're not quite there yet. But while we were there, we actually got them to the point where they were actually walking the beat and interacting with the people. One of my metrics of success was General Jamal and I hosted a weekly TV station, a weekly TV show where local community was able to call in and ask us questions. As you can imagine, during the first few months, most of the questions were directed towards myself because we were viewed as the policing authority. Towards the end of our 15-month rotation, I received very few questions, and they were all directed towards General Jamal. Again, a success. Iraqis holding their elected leaders, or in this case, security force leaders, accountable for their actions. And then just as we left, we reached out, our rule of law working group reached out and established a couple of critical partnerships with the Kirkuk Jurist Union, and we recently received a grant to fund and establish a women's aid clinic. So again, those are just a couple of the highlights. You can go to the next slide. A couple of the highlights that we were able to achieve during our 15 months in Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Carter?
Thank you, and thank you to the Dash family for having us here and to Georgetown for sponsoring this conference. It's a pleasure to be here to talk, and Colonel Paschal mentioned a civilian lawyer who served on his civil affairs team and his PRT, and that was essentially what I did in Iraq. I was a civilian lawyer who had served in the Army for several years before law school, got out because in fall 2001 there wasn't a lot going on, and went to law school, and then came back on active duty to go to Iraq in 2005, and ended up as the operations officer for a provincial reconstruction team and a police advisory task force that was sort of fused at the hip. And to put us in context, we were a bit south and a bit backwards in time from where his brigade operated. We were in the Diyala province, which is just south and to the east of Kirkuk, and north of Baghdad. It's a diverse province that we said mirrored Iraq in terms of demographics and terrain. We oftentimes would call it Little Iraq. And we were also there in 2005, 2006, which was a very different time in Iraq history in the 6-year war that we're now in as of today. 2005 and 2006 was probably the darkest part of that war. And our focus was primarily on security, but also on transition, because to set the stage, our orders from the president were to transition the effort to the Iraqis, to stand them up so that we could stand down. And so our mandate, and this came down through each level of command in slightly different language, was transition control of the provinces to the Iraqis, transition security to the Iraqis, transition control for the rule of law to the Iraqis. As the police transition team, excuse me, we came in with a mandate that was focused on the police. And we figured out pretty quickly that that was too narrow. It was too focused on the police, for one, and it essentially ignored the rest of the rule of law system of systems. Courts, lawyers, jails, the people, legal education, none of that was addressed when we came into country. PRTs were something they did up in Afghanistan, but not in Iraq yet. And even police advisors were still a concept in development. We were one of the first teams to live outside the wire with our counterparts, so we didn't live on a U.S. base. We lived instead in downtown Bakuba at the police headquarters, which was great for advisory operations, not so good for our security and our digestion. But war stories aside, we had a very unique task organization, which is the military parlance for the way things are structured in your organization. We had military and we had civilian. On the military side, we had a team of advisors like me that was supposed to work with the provincial headquarters and with the provincial government. And this was a lot like a staff. So we had an administrative person and an intelligence person, an operations person, which was me, a logistics person, and so forth. We also had subordinate military police platoons, and these were organized to us and then broken apart into squads of about 9 to 11 people. And the idea was that these squads would then form the nucleus of little advisor teams that could go around the province and work with police throughout the Diyala province, which is about, I don't remember the terrain anymore, but it's about 1.5 million people, a pretty large chunk of terrain. We also had a civil affairs team, a tactical human intelligence team, and some other assets that came to us from time to time, like a rifle platoon for extra security or civil affairs and psychological operations teams. We weren't the most important part of the effort, though. The most important part of the effort were the civilians. And here we had two groups international police liaison officers who were civilian cops from the United States that had come over to Iraq under a contract held by the State Department with DynCorp. They typically were beat cops, a little bit more senior than the guy that maybe just got out of the academy. Probably 5 to 10 years was the average experience. We typically did not get police officers with substantial management or investigative experience. You know, the lieutenants and the captains weren't coming over as IPLOs. It was usually your sergeants and your guys that had been field training officers. Second, we had international corrections trainers. These were civilian jail wardens that had come over on a contract with the Justice Department, and they were contractors for MPRI that were seconded to DynCorp with some sort of a weird logistical arrangement. You get a sense of the organizational spaghetti we had to deal with. We also had interpreters. The Army, even to this day, lacks a functional Arabic capability, and so we relied heavily on interpreters that were also civilian contractors. These were a combination of local nationals from Iraq and U.S. nationals who came over with security clearances. And then, of course, we had the PRT. The Provincial Reconstruction Team was a tremendous innovation, but it didn't exist when we got on the ground. It came into being about halfway into our tour. It was a hybrid of civil affairs officers, State Department Foreign Service officers, contractors, civilian employees from a couple of different agencies, including the Justice Department. And its rule of law capability was captured in two positions. One was a lawyer from the Justice Department, terrific guy named Don Calvert, and the second was an unfilled State Department position. And we, as most brigades did, filled that with a military person who happened to be a lawyer. In this case, it was me. In terms of major initiatives, we started with the police because that's what our job was. That's what our bosses wanted us to focus on. And to give you a sense of where the police were in 2005, you had a force that was focused primarily on security. We like to call them blue-suited infantry because they didn't have the capability to do law enforcement. In many cases, they were illiterate. We struggled with about a 50% literacy rate on the Iraqi force, which mirrored that of society. They obviously didn't know the law, didn't have training in enforcing the law. Even those officers that had been through the Baghdad Police College or the Jordan Academy or the Suleimani Academy had only had 10 weeks of training in Iraqi law, and they still had the bare bones foundation for law enforcement as we would know it. You would contrast that with a 6-month academy and all of the secondary education and collegiate education of a U.S. police officer, and you can see the difference in caliber that we're talking about. So we worked at a very elemental level at training them on fundamental tasks of search and seizure, of arrest, of security patrols, the very barest of bones. And then at the next level above that, trying to train their leaders to think in terms of, if there's crime in an area, that's where we want to put the police. If we're having abuse issues, maybe we should discipline those people. If we're out of bullets, we need to request them from our headquarters. If we have no cars, we need to request those too. So the barest of management tasks, that's where we were in 2005, 2006. We also conducted a lot of combined action missions. At this point, there was a real need in U.S. forces, and I think this persisted until about 2007, to stiffen the spine, if you will, of the Iraqi forces, to conduct a lot of missions in tandem with them. And so we regularly engaged in what we'd call McGruff the crime dog patrols, walking around the neighborhood, handing out PSYOP literature, handing out toys, interacting with citizens, doing what we could to build relations between us and the community. And we also ran some other initiatives with the police. Doing that, we realized it wasn't enough. The biggest eyesore for us was the detention area, and I think this mirrors what you all saw in Kirkuk. We had a jail built for 200 that was holding 500. And many of the detainees in this prison had been languishing there for years with no process, no hearings, and no representation. And so we saw this as sort of a sucking chest wound in the rule of law system. And if we could fix this through engaging the courts and the jails and other actors in the rule of law system, then we might be able to affect some meaningful change. And so we initiated a working group that was similar to yours. We initiated daily engagements with these individuals. We drank an awful lot of chai, and we gradually reduced that population to about half of what it was. It wasn't our success, though. What we found is that there was a very indirect effect of this effort. It was probably more successful than we would have imagined, but it was so successful because it wasn't an American effort, it was an Iraqi effort. We did what we could to ask questions. We engaged our counterparts directly behind closed doors, but ultimately what we wanted to see was them taking the step to release people. The Iraqi judge was the one signing the release order. It wasn't one of us ordering these people out of their jail. And I think that may have been our one great success while we were there, was pushing the Iraqis into the lead to the point where they felt confident and capable in their system and willing to do so. We also worked with the provincial government. At this time, the provincial government was fairly dysfunctional. Fortunately, they are out the door thanks to the provincial elections. But they didn't make law because they didn't feel they had the authority under the Iraqi constitution to make law. There was a running debate over whether the Iraqi constitution at the time was legitimate. I remember one engagement with the chief judge of the province where my goal was to get him to teach a class to the Iraqis, and I went in and drank some tea with him and talked about various things and said, "Judge Tadu, I have a favor to ask." He says, "Captain Kato, whatever you like." We had a pretty good relationship. He said, "Judge Tadu, I'd like you to teach a class to the Iraqi police on the law." This was part of our effort to teach the police the law, and we figured if we had an Iraqi judge teach the class, then it would be a better class, and it would help them take ownership. He said, "No, I'm too busy." I said, "Well, it'd be really important if you did this." He said, "No, it's a conflict of interest. There are separations of powers issues. There are timing issues. There are all sorts of issues." He had probably 7 different reasons why he didn't want to do it. He even said at one point, "No, the Iraqi police, they're thugs, and it would taint the court if I were to associate too closely with the Iraqi police." Finally, we prevailed on him, the chief judge of the province, to teach the class as a personal favor to us. And he asked, "Well, what should I teach on?" And I said, "I have an idea. Why don't you teach the class on the Iraqi constitution?" And he said, sort of with a wry grin, "You mean your constitution?" I said, "No, Judge. I mean your constitution, the one that you passed a few months back and ratified, with a vote." He said, No, the one that you wrote for us and then you made us pass." I said, "No, Judge, the one that you ratified. It's your constitutional process. You're the chief judge of the province. You should be proud of this." He said, "You mean the one that the occupying army forced us to write and pass and is now here to enforce?" And clearly he was toying with me, but the point was made that even he, as the chief judge of the province, wasn't invested in this document. So we had a long way to go towards that. I don't know that we ever got there. When we left in 2006, violence was spiraling out of control. The police were actors in that violence. They were largely to blame, I think, for much of what we saw in 2007, 2008, highlighting for me the need, and I think for many in this area, to see police reform as part of a larger construct and a need to reform not just the security forces but also the government agencies that control them, whether it be the Ministry of the Interior or ultimately the Prime Minister's office. We had 3 basic metrics of success. We looked at reports to the Joint Coordination Center, which was kind of like an Iraqi 911 call center, as a measure of success because they reflected the Iraqis' faith in the system. If you're willing to turn in your neighbor, then you probably thought the rule of law system was pretty good. We looked at throughput in the judicial system, that is, detainees arrested, detainees charged, detainees convicted, transferred to prison, and based on that throughput, we could figure out where the stoppages were. Those metrics were fairly granular, and I'd like to say we saw improvement during our time. But the third metric was aggregate violence. And, of course, here we saw worsening over time, so that between fall 2005 and fall 2006, we saw things spiral out of control. And there was a disconnect here. We think that we saw improvement in the police, but deterioration in the security situation because the police were making the situation worse. That is because in many ways they were a tool of the Shiite leadership of Iraq at the time. In many ways the police were active in Shiite death squad activity, and in many ways they were players in the sectarian war. Our efforts actually inflamed the situation. And I think had we adopted maybe a more holistic strategy or taken some of the measures that Colonel Martins and others were able to take the following year with the new strategy, we probably would have seen improvement on all 3 fronts. That's all I've got. I'd like to hand it off now to Mr. Mantini. Mr. Spencer.
Thank you. I'm John Mantini, and I have to say up front, disclaimer, that I'm subbing in for Phil Lynch, who was the Rule of Law Coordinator, and I have to say I'm a poor substitute for Phil, who is a legend in his own right in terms of his Army career and the work that he did in Iraq. I was privileged enough to work with Phil while I was in Iraq from November of 2007 until the end of October 2008, and also with Colonel Martins, who did a great job while he was there in Iraq. And my full-time job is with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and I don't know how many of you have heard of MCC, but what we do is we're trying to implement foreign development assistance in a little bit different way. Do it as a business model rather than simply giving money away to poor countries. And unlike countries like Iraq, we're dealing with stable countries that have a significantly poor population. And we have 18 compacts, 18 agreements that we've entered into with various countries throughout the world, including Africa, Latin America, and parts of Eastern Europe. And I am a retired Air Force judge advocate and also have prior Army experience before I went to law school with the 20th Infantry Division as a platoon leader. And I felt a significant hole in my career in the sense that I had never been to a combat zone. My father's a World War II vet, and I felt like it was my obligation to do something, to whatever I could, to help this effort along. So I volunteered in the summer of 2007 to go to Baghdad, and I was fortunate enough to get selected, and I went as a detailee with the State Department. And I initially was assigned to an office called Joint Strategic Planning and Assessment, or JSPA. And as I'm sitting here today and looking at some of my old colleagues, including Carl Peach, all of the acronyms that I had put to the back of my mind all of a sudden came bursting forth, and I'm glad to see that I haven't forgotten them. But anyway, JSPA, what we did was work with the ambassador and the DCM and the other staff, embassy staff, on what was called the Joint Campaign Plan, which was a campaign plan devised by General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker for the way ahead in Iraq, which was supposed to eventually lead to the Iraqis taking control of their own destiny. And I worked in the rule of law area in that regard. And the one thing that hit me when I first got to Iraq was the fact that I really wasn't prepared for the complete diversity, the amount of diversity there was in Iraq in the terms of the number of people and the number of groups that were doing work there in Iraq. And I'd have to say that in all of my career, both as a military judge advocate and as a civilian attorney, the talent level in Iraq, the level of talent and the people, the dedication of the people there is simply eye-watering. I mean, it is just unbelievable to see the people, the amount of good work that they want to do, the hard work that is put in. The problem with that is, unless you have a good plan in place to direct those forces, to direct your effort, that what you end up having is a lot of time people doing a lot of different things in an uncoordinated way. And one of the things that struck me is when I started going through documents and ideas that I had about things that needed to be done in Iraq, I would go and search through files and I would find that somebody had actually worked on that issue and had done a significant amount of work on it. But then at some point the work just stopped and ended, and it never got completed. And I don't think a week went by when I didn't meet someone else, someone like Spencer here, who was in Iraq doing a particular project, somebody from USAID doing a project, somebody from the State Department, somebody from some other NGO. And so when Phil Lynch got there shortly after I did in December, and he sat down with Colonel Martins, and we came up with this idea that we were going to take what was the classified joint campaign plan, and out of that derive a real working plan that you could use, that we could share with the Iraqis, share with other NGOs, so that we would try to make this a more coordinated effort in dealing with this whole concept of rule of law. So we started about in January of last year, January of 2008, and we began this process, just a small effort within the embassy, thinking about what is the definition of the rule of law, what does that mean, what are the various elements. And like Mr. Nachbar said, there's a lot of disagreement on exactly what rule of law means, but we came up with this idea. And to a person, all of the senior leaders in Iraq recognized that this whole idea of rule of law, having the society governed by law, is probably after security, is the most important thing that you need. I mean, it was a constant theme from General Petraeus. It was a constant theme from Ambassador Crocker. And so we got this plan, basically started to get it drafted up, and we pulled in our military colleagues, those of us who were on the State Department side. And then in June, I transferred down halfway through my tour to the Rule of Law Coordinator's office. And the way the Rule of Law effort is set up in Iraq, the Justice Department is tasked with being the lead civilian agency for the rule of law. And this was memorialized by former Ambassador Khalilzad in a March 2007 memo. And the first Rule of Law Coordinator, Jim Santel, was an unbelievably hard worker, but he simply didn't have the staff because they hadn't staffed up sufficiently. By the time Phil got there in January, they started to build the staff, and they brought in a great staff, many folks who were U.S. attorneys, assistant U.S. attorneys from offices throughout the country, some state prosecutors. They also built up the Justice Attache's office, which is now headed up by Larry Farrell, a very experienced prosecutor out of Missouri. And what we began to do was to build this plan. And we also had a person from an Army JAG, Dick Prejean, who was actually assigned to the embassy. And what he's doing is heading up a little group called the IROC, which is a coordinating office between the Rule of Law Coordinator's office and the MNFI SJA's office, which is headed up now by Colonel Gady. And what we did is we came slowly but surely. We started to build the projects get a compilation of the projects that were being done throughout Iraq by all the different PRTs and all the brigade combat teams. And as we did that, we started to get a sense of what was going on. And for example, Carl Peach at the Baghdad PRT, they were instrumental in starting a legal defense clinic out at Rusafa. And this legal defense clinic actually brought in Iraqi attorneys in conjunction with the Iraqi Bar Association, and this was the first time that a lot of these detainees had actually met with an attorney. And it was going out there to pay this a visit. It was really interesting. Imagine a little trailer, and inside the trailer are two lawyers, and detainees are coming in, shuttling in and out, and they have a little paper file that has the charge down for the detainee, and the lawyers are meeting with these detainees, and for many of them, the first time they ever met with an attorney. And that legal defense clinic became the model for projects that are going to be initiated throughout the rest of Iraq in terms of setting up legal defense clinics at strategic provinces throughout Iraq. So the concept here is to basically take the great work that people are doing in individual locations and then spread that wealth around, sort of like creating a database of information. And in that way, we prevent this whole idea of one day when you go into your office, you find out that there's another NGO that has just arrived, and they are going to do some training of judges. And you've already figured out in your mind that you knew about all the training of judges that was going on in Iraq, but in reality, you don't. The other thing that we wanted to do was also integrate some of our international partners, those countries that were part of the coalition, and even those that weren't part of the coalition but expressed an interest in being in Iraq and doing rule of law effort in Iraq. For example, the European Commission funded an effort to restructure the law college curriculum in Iraq. And come to find out that when you talk about building the rule of law, we wanted to get beyond simply just the criminal law aspects, what we call police, prisons, and prosecutions. And what we found out is that Iraq was severely deficient in the area of commercial law. they had really no commercial code. So when you're trying to attract international businesses to come into Iraq, what sort of assurance are these companies going to have that their agreements are going to be upheld if there's really no dedicated structure of commercial law? So this is one of the things that the European Commission, through the help of this distinguished French professor, came into Iraq and started this whole process of restructuring the law curriculum of Iraq. And I'm proud to say that Georgetown was instrumental recently last year in hosting the dean of the Baghdad College of Law and the assistant dean, which is the oldest law college in Iraq, in bringing them here to the U.S. and getting a view of what law school curriculum in the U.S. is like and what international business transaction law is like and what's needed in their country. Overall, and the other thing I want to mention was that Ambassador Crocker was so interested in this, he had the Rule of Law Coordinator's Office oversee a Rule of Law assessment. And so what we did is we took this action plan and we broke it down into its various elements, and we looked at every aspect that we thought was relevant of the Rule of Law, and then gave the ambassador initially what we thought was going to be a 90-minute session. It turned into 4 90-minute sessions, and then they have recently published the findings of the Rule of Law assessment. So this is going to be the working document that folks work from in the Rule of Law area. I still think there are things that can be done. Obviously, a lot of things that need to be coordinated, but at least I think we've got a good foundation for the way ahead and how to handle rule of law in Iraq. Thanks. I'm going to turn it over to Spence Spencer.
Hi, I'm Spence Spencer. I want to firstly say thanks to the Dash family, as would be appropriate, as well as Rosa, Rachel, and Marie for pulling this whole thing together. As the sole NGO person here on the table, maybe my role is to be a little bit of a gadfly on some of these things. And but first, let me just start and give you guys sort of the story of what we do in Iraq and the programs that we're implementing right now. We are a very, very small human rights law NGO, and we are implementing a project that is funded by the State Department's Human Rights Bureau, and under the rubric Legislative Support to Protect Human Rights and the Rule of Law. And we have 3 international attorneys in Baghdad all the time, and they're supplemented by 4 Iraqi translators and legal experts as well that also work with us. All of the internationals, the international attorneys, including myself, have been in Iraq, or at least worked on Iraqi legal issues since at least 2005. One is a remorseful CPA lawyer even, who is trying to make good now that he's on the other side here. But, you know, I want to stress that a lot of our work is based on relationships and long-standing relationships we've had with Iraqi leaders, members of parliament, and, you know, civil society leaders and things like that. And that's critical. My good friends at the Human Rights Bureau called me up when they said we want to give you this grant. And they said, but you got to cut your funding by half, as always. This is how this works. And you know, going through it, it was just, you know, draconian trying to cut the budget to meet these requirements. And when I went back to it, I looked at it and I said, you know, what is the priority here for us? And that is a permanent presence on the ground of internationals and Iraqis that can be there to answer the phone 24/7. And that was the one goal. You know, so the conferences and the, you know, the trips to Istanbul or whatever, all that stuff was cut out. And in fact, getting back to basics, you need to have the relationships. And that's something that I really want to stress. One other thing that we do is we have an excellent partnership with Georgetown Law's Human Rights Center, Cardozo Law in New York City, and UVA Law, in which we are working with human rights law clinics and law students to try to pull together good comparative legal memoranda. Just to step back a bit, we work primarily with the Iraqi parliament, and we are there to provide substantive legal assistance on draft legislation. We have memorandums of understandings with two of the main committees, the Human Rights Committee and the Legal Committee of the Parliament. The Legal Committee gets the final bite of the apple when it comes to revising draft legislation. But the way that we do this is we try to, A, make ourselves useful, and that is that if we come in as a human rights organization and say, hi, we're from this human rights organization, and we've been thinking a lot about what you guys need in Washington, and you really need to do X, 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 and X, we're not proselytizers, and what we want to do is demonstrate our usefulness for them. So we will work on legislation such as a diplomatic service law, which I worked on, or alternately things like enabling legislation for the Ministry of Education, things like that. And that's an important thing. Another important thing that we try to do when we work with the Iraqi parliament is highlight best practices, look at lessons learned from around the world in terms of good legislation, and bring them to them. And at that point, it's up to them. The legal memoranda process is to highlight ideas. We will even go so far as to put sample language in an annex, for example, to highlight some of the options that these guys have. But we want to be very clear that we're there to support the legislative process, and we're foreigners, and we freely recognize our limitations as foreigners. One thing that John mentioned was Baghdad Law and Ali Al-Rufai and Salah, who are the dean and associate deans, and we also have a close partnership with them. And we work with Baghdad Law and the faculty and students, A, hopefully to develop some sort of clinical law training down the road, but B, to be able to draw on them and other Iraqi actors to try to ground what we write in the legislative analysis that we provide in Iraqi jurisprudence. And I want to say at the outset that Iraq has a pretty strong set of laws. It's actually quite good, and by grounding it, and rather than reinventing the wheel legislatively, we can actually say, no, you need to take this law from 1937, add the following 5 articles, and this is probably the best approach, amending existing legislation. We are. And this is, again, sort of in light of all the discussions about coordination, I'm going to make a statement, and it's sort of a scary one. We are apparently the only organization currently offering substantive legal assistance to the Council of Representatives. And I say that because a lot of people would take issue with that. But in reality, what we have seen is that the Americans get involved in general when they have an issue that they want to work on. In general, that's when they choose to engage with parliamentarians. We saw this, for example, with the Status of Forces Agreement process. We see this also with the Provincial Elections Bill, sort of an ex deus machina type function almost. And the U.S. Embassy's interaction with the Parliament is surprisingly limited. UNAMI, the United Nations Assistance Mission to Iraq, they're also there. We also see those guys, and they will also try to hammer an elections bill together, or they'll work on things like that. But and then finally you'll see NGOs and Beltway bandits and other groups that will drift in, and they'll do things like we'll walk up to them and say, "Hey, wow, what are you doing here?" And they'll say, "We're reorganizing the Speaker's Secretariat office." In other words, we're working on procedural rules. We're working on non-substantive law, and that's the whole thing that I see, at least from our perch, is that there are a lot of people who are wanting to help and fundamentally good people, but nobody's actually grabbing the bull by the horns and working systematically and comprehensively with the Iraqi parliament. Just to give you guys an idea of the demand, I was there, I just got back about 2 weeks ago, and we went to all the stations of the cross of the parliament, and we said, well, what are your legislative priorities? Where do you guys want to go this year? And they're looking at elections in December, and they are, elected officials, so they now have to demonstrate a little legislative activity, probably a lot more than what they've been doing in the past. And we wound up with roughly 40 to 45 requests, depending on how you count them, to mark up draft legislation. And we are only, we're a total team of 7, and we're supported by a number of schools, but that is a titanic job. We're working right now, for example, on minority legislation, on a whole series of that's about 4 different pieces of legislation within that rubric. We're working very closely with Georgetown law and Baghdad law on refugee and IDP law, which is, again, not one piece of legislation, but the idea of what legislation is needed to bring somebody back home. And that includes property, that includes identity card legislation, that includes a whole series of things that we're working on. One of the things that all of us have been trying to do is implement the Constitution, and this is a major priority for the Iraqis as well. And Iraq's Constitution, for example, identifies there are 58 out of 144 articles that say, for example, a Human Rights Commission shall be established by law, and that's it. And so there's huge gaping holes in the Constitution, and that needs to be taken up. Social benefits. The Iraqis are trying to develop packages of what I would call economic and social rights that need to be codified. And, this is protection for the widows, protection for martyrs, protection for a wide group of vulnerable populations. NGO laws, freedom of expression, media law, juvenile detention, even revenue sharing as part of the constitutional process between the center and the governorates. I mean, I just wanted to rattle off this list because it is titanic, and it's a very big job, and like I said, it's either a wonderful thing, as I tell people, it's either a wonderful thing that we have such a tall order to fill, but it's also a nightmare, and quite frankly, I think it's both. It's a real complicated mess. We track the Parliament. We track the legal system, and our main interactions are with Iraqi parliamentarians, civil society, and academics who flit in and out. And one of the conversations about judges should not talk about law enforcement reminds me of the story where I was at a conference of academics on constitutional law in Amman, Jordan, and all of these excellent law professors from across the country were there. And we went up to them and said, "You guys need to get involved in this. The Iraqi legislature needs your help." They said, it's unseemly for us to get involved in politics. We're not going to do it. Same sort of thing. But the international side, besides working with the Iraqis day in, day out, and like I said, we're punching a clock here, is amazingly complicated, and it is the organizational spaghetti and worse, especially for an outsider. And I must say, as a former Foreign Service officer, I might have more of an understanding than most about the inner workings of the U.S. government. But by and large, the work of the U.S. government is not very transparent to those of us in the NGO community. We work primarily with the State Department's political section. We try to coordinate where possible with the Rule of Law Coordinator's office. But what I've seen, and again, this is sort of me, the gadfly, what I've seen is that the guys at the embassy don't really get out and talk to the Iraqis because they're attending so many coordination meetings. It is literally a problem like that. And we simply do not have the manpower to attend every single coordination meeting that goes on. At least in the civilian side, for example, there's the Rule of Law coordination meeting, there's a legislative drafting coordination meeting, the European Commission has its own coordination meeting, the Iraqi Parliament now wants to have its own coordination meeting. And at the end of the day, you're not working. You're sort of not. You're not adding value. You're only reporting on what you did the previous week when there wasn't a meeting. And I really want to say that this transparency issue is something that is critical for us to do this work. And sort of to paraphrase John, the only thing that we can do as a small NGO is basically just go to as many people as possible and just tell them what we're doing, and hopefully maybe we'll get a bite or a nibble or some area where we can cooperate, and that is about all that we can do, but we're doing it, with the best we possibly can. One thing, too, I'd like to talk about is security. And we're very lucky because our client is the Iraqi parliament. And as a result, they are in the green zone, or whatever, the area formerly known as the international zone. And our offices, we live in a compound in the IZ as well. And so it's very easy for us to travel to talk to our clients. And we go out when we can, to various ministries, the Ministry of Justice, the Shura Council, the Human Rights Ministry, places like that, when we possibly can. But just to give you guys a sense of what it's like on the other side from the NGO community, it costs us $8,000 a day. And that gives us a security team for 24 hours that allows us to go out and have one meeting for about an hour. And so, a lot of this sort of talk about mobility is all wonderful until you actually have to pay for the security, and that's a real obstacle. And one thing that I always like to say is, in Moscow, there are rule of law operations going on somewhere. There's some commercial law project still going on, and you don't hear about it. That's because the environment is permissive. A guy can, even in Moscow, can get into a taxi and go to his meeting, and it's not a big deal. And so long as we do not have a permissive security environment, it will always be like this. And people talk about security and how uproariously expensive. It might be 35-40% of our budget. And it's just over us all the time, having to pay for this and having to do this work. And again, I wanted to stress this sort of coming from the other side. The other thing, too, sort of in closing that I'd like to mention is, the idea of rule of law. And note that it is not just law enforcement. And rule of law is not just human rights even. All of these are all pieces of a bigger holistic process that we need to recognize. We, for example, don't really work that much on criminal law. We don't work on criminal procedure. What we do is we try to build commissions and try to pass minority legislation. But, just again, I want to rattle this off for everybody to hear, and that is there's eight different sections that I've identified: constitutional development, code reform, legal drafting, judicial reform, accountability for past abuses, transitional justice, fighting corruption, democratic policing, and also customary law, like tribal law. And I just throw that out just to show that people talk about rule of law, and the term is sort of used interchangeably with law enforcement in a lot of cases. And I know everybody in this room is smart enough to know the difference, but what happens is that the emphasis becomes on building a security framework that can be done by civilians. And I just want to leave you guys with the thought that this is a lot broader than that. The final point about this is a lot broader than that is that, I'm the sole NGO rep here, but in fact, there ought to be someone here from the United Nations, from the World Bank, from Beltway Bandits. I know that Bill is going to be speaking later, but they're consulting firms. There are a whole vast panoply of actors in this process, and this is also part of the broadening process when we talk about this. And everybody has a role to play, and the coordination is an abject nightmare, but I think that's the nature of the beast, and thank you very much.
Okay, so we're ready to move to the questions phase. So if there's anyone in the audience that has a question for any of our panelists, although I did see that some of the panelists made notes while other individuals were speaking, so they might have rebuttal time that they would like to offer. So if we have questions from the floor. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Derek. I'm from the State Department. I'm in the Iraq Programs Office of the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. Sorry, Spence, you're in the line of fire because you were the last speaker. This is not necessarily a question, just point of information. Coordination is a problem both in the department and in the interagency and in Baghdad. But there actually are NGOs that my bureau and the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau is funding, actually specifically to work with the floor. The University of Utah Law School is actually on the ground. So just to clarify, there is some work being done on the criminal and penal codes, as well as in constitutional review and legislative assistance. Anti-corruption is also being addressed by them. I think just to let you know also, so it's a little bit more refreshing, I have a meeting on Monday with the bureau that funds your grant, JRL, so that we can talk about what our two bureaus are on the ground in Baghdad to try and better coordinate.
You know,
so I just point
And if I could respond to that, we work very closely with the University of Utah, and we try to hang out with them as much as possible because they're great people. I'm not trying to be negative, but anyway, University of Utah has yet to actually deploy any staff. They have just only recently, they had a deputy chief of party who came in just as I was leaving Baghdad, and so we look forward to looking to them, and so I was speaking in the present tense.
In the back, yes, sir.
About how we're rebuilding the rule of law in Iraq almost from scratch. And I was wondering, what was the Iraqi judicial system like? What were they used to doing before we came in and started reworking their system? So when Captain Kurt was talking about the Chief Justice that you were, what was he used to that we have to kind of redirect on their efforts?
Well, it's funny. I'll start by saying that we've been in Iraq 6 years, but we really have been there 1 year 6 times. Because each time one of us comes in, we try to reinvent the wheel. We come up with a new campaign plan and a new strategy. And I think in the Diyala province, you probably saw 6 guys like me come in and say, this is what we're going to do. The provincial courts, which are a very neglected feature of the Iraqi system generally, there are very few parts of the U.S. government that work with them, did exist prior to the invasion. They existed as essentially a superior court would here in the States. They had original jurisdiction over criminal matters and original jurisdiction over civil matters. What we found was that the majority of civil matters were handled by tribal justice or tribal mediation and then brought to the civil courts for essentially a ratification and enforcement mechanism in the Diyala province. And we thought this functioned fabulously. We figured that the more cases could be settled, the better. Some people in the U.S. government didn't feel that. They felt that tribal justice was not necessarily a fair or advanced way to go. But in our view, it was an Iraqi solution and it was good to go. With respect to the criminal processes, we did find that they were handicapped because, as you probably know, the Hussein intelligence apparatus, the Mukhabarat and everything else, really drove the train when it came to serious issues of criminal justice and investigation. And so the crimes they were dealing with were either petty crimes or crimes that had been brought by the state but which were essentially groundless, and they were just there to rubber stamp what the Mukhabarat brought to them. Today, I'm going to defer to the other colleagues for how the justice system stands now.
I could talk a little bit about Kirkuk, and our challenges were the ethnic divides between the Kurds and the Arabs. The Arabs chose not to participate in the elections, in the initial elections, so the Kurdish actually achieved an unfair representation. I alluded to earlier about the ACH who had distrust in the Iraqi system. It's hard for us to appreciate, but ethnicity comes into play in everything. We had an incident that we were establishing, an unfortunate incident that resulted in some deaths, and we wanted to establish a council to conduct the investigation. And different people would not participate because it was a Kurdish-led, it was going to be a Turkmen-led, or it was going to be an Arab judge. You see that in every facet of life. I would receive a call from the chief of police. I want to arrest this guy because he's doing something bad, but he's an Arab, and I can't do it. I said, no, you're the chief of police. You implement enforce the rules of Iraq. So that was the challenges that we were visiting in Kirkuk. Some of it goes back to, as Phillip just talked about, the authoritarian leadership and the dictator and the Ba'athist Party prior to our arrival. But that's the issues that we were facing while we were there.
One of the things that we saw out of Baghdad was a significant deficiency in judicial security. I think that's been alluded to. A number of, I mean, you can imagine the uproar in this country that would occur if a judge was killed. In Iraq, they've had over 30 judges killed. And in the last year, the number rose significantly and culminated in a very important appeals court judge being killed last July. And when we started to look into this, we found that there was no coordinated effort within the Iraqi government for providing judicial security. Judges in most instances were left to their own devices to provide for their own PSDs. You had you had PSDs going around without weapons. There was a complete roadblock of providing weapons cards to personal security details for judges so that they could get protected. And just to sit down and try to come up with a plan that you could coordinate within the element of MOJ, which had a dignitary protection service, and then a person that was dedicated, get a person designated for judicial protection, took a significant amount of time, and even by the time that I had left, it still wasn't finalized. It was well on the way. But if you can't protect judges, that's the basic. You know, one of the basics of your judicial system. You're back to the very ground floor of the rule of law.
If I could add some more bad news to this subject. Just from the constitutional perspective, you know, Iraq's constitution lays out a judiciary, and there have been proposed amendments that would provide legal framework for the entire judiciary. And these are stymied right now due to a lot of the same sort of ethnic issues between Kurdistan and the rest of the country. And so you have very basic legislation to establish, for example, a higher judicial council or establish a federal Supreme Court or a constitutional court, depending on what it is. All of this stuff is being stymied because people are waiting for resolution of the region's relevance and role within a judiciary that is ostensibly run out of Baghdad. As a matter of fact, you know, this is the issue right now, at least U.S. Institute of Peace is working on. They are trying to develop models of an asymmetrical judiciary that can actually start to have people working and developing a viable judiciary. And that's a ray of hope, but everything is still sort of waiting for the grand constitutional bargain to happen in terms of the Constitution. The good news that I'd like to add is that we have worked since roughly 2005 with an advisory group that is just like Baghdad Law provides us with insights into Iraqi law. We work with a team of judges and academics that we try to convene as soon as much as possible to get them to mark up draft legislation. And I will say that all of these guys are very talented, top-notch, brave people who are good, conscientious attorneys. And you know, this is the future, and this is where Iraq will go. It's not us, but it's ultimately these guys taking a stand, and I think that's a great ray of hope.
Ma'am.
I was just going to ask if there was an Iraqi or two on the panel, thinking about the judge who was saying your rule of law, who you would trust as not just being part of a power structure, what might they say about what we're doing? What would their problems be? What would they say? Well, you know, we appreciate the help, but this is what we don't like about your particular rule of law, what you're doing. Not those who are just trying to keep in power, but thoughtful people. What would their critique be?
The same judge, in his first meeting with the Provincial Reconstruction team, had an opportunity to tell the State Department's chief diplomat exactly what his message was. She had a solution for the rule of law problem in the province. Computers. If we automate the courthouses and if we get you guys a case management software like they use in the States, all your throughput problems will be solved. And his response was, no, you know, and it was very diplomatic. No, I don't want them. I like my old methods. I like everything. He was too proud to say they had no electricity. And if they had electricity and they had the more fundamental things, then we might think about computers. But I think his larger message would be, give us what we need, but then empower us to run our system ourselves. And unfortunately, I don't think we've done a good enough job or as well as we could have in either one.
I believe also, ma'am, what they would say, and I think it's been highlighted by all the panelists, is have a respect for our law. And I think each of them have said we need to work within the host nation law, whatever that is, and have a better understanding of us, because I doubt any of us were trained in the Baghdad School of Law before we went to Baghdad. So gaining an understanding of host nation law, I think, is what they would ask of us as well.
I think also this raises a fundamental question about rule of law assistance and what the military is doing with this, which is, it's fundamentally contradictory to have the soldiers help with the legal solutions. That's just a central contradiction with this sort of work. But secondly, too, I think that every Iraqi recognizes that the United States government is going to work for the interests of the United States government. And that's transparent. And, we might not, people are very good-hearted and want to do the right thing. And, people are actually not necessarily thinking of the USG interests. But, that is writ large pretty much across a lot of the U.S. government's work across the spectrum.
Ma'am, I believe we had another question.
Karen, this is a question for all the panelists as you sort of look into the crystal ball of the future. We're slowly going to be reducing our footprint militarily, and yet when you look at funding cycles for a Department of Justice or an NGO or contractor future for the rule of law programming, what are we going to do? If you look in 3 years, where will we be if we cannot provide the necessary security? It's not policing. Where are we going?
I'll give you the trout look. I think, because it's near and dear to my heart, the Kirkuk province. Just having spent 15 months there, and it's probably the central issue that's facing Iraq right now, is the future of Kirkuk. Is it going to become part of the Kurdish regional government, Kurdistan, or will it remain an autonomous province or a province of Iraq? But those issues are larger and have to be solved by the central government. It's a local problem that without buy-in from the central government and the political parties there, we're going to have issues. So I think until they can address those ethnic and sectarian issues in Kirkuk, there's going to be challenges in that particular part of Iraq.
The President's strategy to withdraw responsibly in Iraq leaves a residual force of 3 components: counterterrorism, support to the embassy, and advising, supporting, and training Iraqi security forces provided they meet certain conditions. And so with that last one, I think you're going to see continued funding levels for the State Department INL's advisors to the police and the Justice Department's advisors to other parts of the rule of law system. It is a question as to how you will secure those advisors and those other rule of law actors, whether they're on PRTs or they're in advisor teams. And I think that question's being worked. At some point, the tread lines down in your direction have to go that way. And the question will be, how do you harmonize the various presences to make sure that you're not putting people in harm's way without the support they need to be there? I do think that's going to be a very tough challenge.
I think one of the things that's been instrumental in making the amount of progress that we've had is that in the Rule of Law Coordinator's office, especially now, you have people like Phil Lynch who have got tremendous amount of military experience and experience as a U.S. assistant U.S. attorney. So that level of expertise, you need to. I think you really need to be selective in the type of people that you send over to these assignments and make sure that you have people with that level of expertise that are familiar. The person who's there now, Doug Allen, who's a rule of law coordinator, had a previous tour in Iraq and understands some of these issues. And I'm at the risk of being impolitic, I will have to say that at some instances, people have to recognize that if somebody is in charge of a function, that other agencies are going to have to subordinate their interests and let that person lead and let that person make decisions, because there's not enough of that goes on, and there's too much of people saying, well, this is my rice bowl, and you're not going to put your little hand in my rice bowl. And until that stops, we'll waste money.
The Obama strategy had three components. Number one, withdrawal of U.S. forces, but number two, support for governance and institution building and trying to get Iraqis on the right on their feet. And this also includes refugee and IDP support as well. I thought that was very heartening to hear him actually specifically pull that issue out of the mix. And then the last component of it is regional engagement. And I am a little bit more optimistic, at least broad brush, on the fact that regions, regional players, for example, the Syrians and the Iranians and even the Saudis can bring more to bear here. In the European community, we've seen, as part of sort of a thaw about Iraq, the German foreign minister was in Baghdad and Erbil just about 10 days ago, for example, and there's a European Commission is now funding up. It's a broader set of issues and broad brush. It'll be great. But I will also say that the role of the U.S. government is going to be even more pronounced, and that's because of the financial downturn. I was up in New York talking to various foundations and trying to get a minorities program funded, and they've been hurt hard. And a lot of the foundations that do this work are just not as capable. I heard 20-30% declines in endowments, for example, in some of the private foundations. And what this means is that it's going to be even more up to the United States government to pick up the ball.
Ma'am.
Margaret Bond. I spent a couple years in Iraq as a civil affairs officer, and I appreciate Captain Carter's comment that we've been in this area for 6 years, but it's really 1 year 6 times. And I think many of you have talked about the same problems that you encountered when you got there. You figured out you needed to make a plan and integrate the efforts beyond just the immediate region. That unless you have a good plan, you have a lot of different people doing a lot of different things in an uncoordinated way, and so forth. We are really fortunate in this environment to be with people who have experience and people who are continuing to have an interest and want to bring their experience into making the situation more to in the level of success. If you were going to go back and look at 3 things that you would have done differently or planned for differently or had the ability to change before you went to Iraq, could you identify what those are so that we might be able to make our future efforts there less 1 year, 6 times more a coordinated process toward a successful conclusion?
I'll take a stab at it. I think, first of all, as part of our PDS, our reconnaissance system, we have to make the assumption that our predecessors did something a certain way, and I think it goes back to the Rice Bowl question. How do you build on your predecessor's success? And that's what we tried to do, and that's why I said we developed our campaign plan really, as you said, in a vacuum back here. But when we got over there, we wanted to do an interaction with the brigade that we replaced, but more importantly with the provincial reconstruction team. And then, as you said, a willingness to put your ego aside and do things for the right reasons to achieve success. And from me, it was to involve the Iraqis in everything. And it goes back to your question, ma'am, earlier. What do Americans? We want to put our way of doing it. We know we could come into a village and tell you what we need, but that might not be the values. That might not be what that local village requires. It makes us feel good to build a school, but if that's not their priority, they're not going to man it. They're not going to put teachers there. They're not going to secure it. So from my perspective, those are 3 things that I'd focus on.
1, learn Arabic. 2, read more, and specifically about Iraq. I put myself through somewhat of a graduate course before going, but it still wasn't enough. And 3, acquire more funding authority by whatever means I possibly could. That is, more SERP authority, more approval authority from my commanders for government contracts. Whatever the case may be, money is a weapon system. And it's a cliche in today's military, but we still haven't pushed that authority down far enough and given commanders in the field enough flexibility with it, with the requisite transparency and accountability. And I think those are the three things. But learn Arabic would be big, bold letters.
For me, I would piggyback on some of these comments. First, I didn't have enough understanding of what the structure was in Iraq in terms of all of the different elements there, and it took me the better part of 2 months to sort of sort that out myself, and then to get from predecessors what they had done previously and build on that, and then especially a big highlight in terms of the funding sources. Get a better understanding of funding, how funding works. I mean, people like that are just golden. People that understand appropriations law and understand how our system works, where's the money going, and how we can get the Iraqis to start spending some of their money on some of these projects.
My top three would be, firstly, integrate with the Iraqi justice and system and try to pull in and draw on Iraqi practices. These are the guys who gave us Hammurabi. They've got a long track record of this, and we should be drawing on Iraqi legal tradition and using that to reinforce, and make improvements where necessary. And that means standing up Iraqi actors and working with them and doing what they want, not just what we want. The second thing is it is about Arabic. It is about cultural awareness, and it's also about, I wish that we had more civil law experts. The U.S. being a common law jurisdiction, and Iraq, has a Code Napoleon that was inherited from Egypt. It's a very long story via France, but having people and having legal experts who understand the civil law system is another one of those training points that is absolutely critical for this. And then lastly, too, I would urge, my number three is get resources, get this thing adequately resourced, but also look at this holistically. All of us open up the paper and see about the $7 billion police training academy with the water dripping from the ceiling, and in fact, that might be wonderful, but a lot of the resources are going into areas that are getting oversubscribed, and there's other areas out of those that I've rattled off before that also deserve support, and that is, for example, legislative drafting and transitional justice and things like that.
We have a question in the back, sir.
Hi, Scott Worthy from the U.S. Institute of Peace. I work on rule of law issues in Afghanistan, so a lot of this is constructive work and cautionary. I've been wondering about the comments that was made a few weeks ago, and I wanted to ask that as a question to the panel. With Iraq, one of the extraordinary circumstances of it compared to the rule of law program is the security risk, and therefore militaries have to be involved. I'm just wondering, especially for the panelists that have experience with the military, absent dire security conditions, is the military the right institution to do this? Are some aspects of it correct and some not? What would you recommend for a lesser security situation?
I would say the military is absolutely not the right instrument for it. Even as a military police officer with a substantial amount of legal education, I don't think that we are institutionally properly set up or oriented as a culture to do it. We tend to create things in our own image. So when we created the Iraqi police force, we essentially created a blue-suited military force with minimal law enforcement capability. I would much rather see the State Department with its IPLOs in the lead. I would much rather see NGOs and some sort of rule of law task force in the lead. But you're absolutely right that with the security situation as it is, there is no one to fill the gap of integrating all of this and creating the infrastructure of convoys and forward operating bases and so forth to get those people out to where they have to do the job. And so for the near term, I think the military is filling the gap. The key to success is ensuring that the leadership of this effort, or the at least the intellectual and conceptual leadership of this effort, comes from this side of the table. Because if we're doing it, and I say we because I wore a green suit when I did this, it's going to be too militarized of an effort.
I concur wholeheartedly, and But one of the challenges when you talk about that provincial reconstruction team, and again, speaking for Kirkuk, it's about 60 people. And for a population of 1.3 million, it was challenging for them to have the effect. Their focus was exactly where it needed to be, on the province of Kirkuk and tying the province into the central government. What I was able to do and what we tried to do with guidance and really in a supporting effort was to tie in those districts and local villages and councils to the provincial government. Sometimes it becomes a matter of size, but we are definitely not the prime force that should be doing that.
I'll add there's something of a unity of effort, unity of command, and synchronization issue here too. It becomes very easy to become desynchronized, such that you might have one line of operation trying to achieve security effects with a raid, for example, but your rule of law operation will be doing something completely different in that area, and you're going to have to manage that. And what I saw was that the military was the best suited organization to organize those concerns and manage them through the staff and command process. And that on the civilian side of the house, there was no analogous process. There was no targeting meeting. There was no effects meeting. There was no way to bring it all together. And so one of the things going forward, and I know I have some friends at SCRS that are trying to work on this, is developing analogous things on the civilian side so that you can manage these processes and ultimately get to the point where civilians are in the lead with everything on the military side subordinated to them.
Sir. If I could just add one more thing. It's not boots on the ground that's important. It's wingtips on the ground. And, again, speaking for at least my organization, we could use that 40% of our budget that's earmarked for security, for our own private security firm, and use that in better ways. And that's just a function of the permissiveness of the environment.
Sir.
I doubt, having worked with a lot of your peers in SAC rule of law and what we're doing as their favorite type of mission. They're going to be having a fire maneuver and do what we think we join the military to do. But regardless, if we're going to do this, what can we do to educate, to train, to make commanders and young officers and NCOs see this as just as important as attacking that hill?
Well, I think you hit it. It's an education, it's a training, and we probably have to start it at the entry level. As we look back at our young officers that are coming in, causing them, if we were going to pay an ROTC scholarship, we might want to force them to learn Arabic or take international studies. The challenge is at time. We are a military, and we're here to fight our nation's wars. And you have to figure out what's the appropriate level of time that you're going to direct at maintaining your core competencies and then the ability to execute these other competencies. Some of the things that I did before deployment, I'm sure my high school civics teacher is rolling over in her grave the fact that I was helping work with a governor of a province. But I was not trained to do that. I can lead a raid, I can lead an attack. So I, again, tried to use the expertise of our civilian counterparts in the partnership with them. But before deployment, I made all my lieutenants attend local council meetings so they understood the challenges that local city councils dealt with in the states, because I knew they would be helping to advise and mentor councils. So I think as part of the training program, it's important that you address some of these other issues. It's a larger education program for military officers to understand that the non-kinetic operations are more important than the kinetic operations. Security can only set the conditions for these other elements of national power to work. On my slide, I considered myself, or during my deployment, once we established the appropriate level of security, I was a supporting effort for the provincial reconstruction team. He took the lead, and you have to understand that. We had no formal command and control relationship. It was handshake on, for lack of a better term. But I think we had a common goal and realized that we needed to work together. So it goes back to, you hit it. It's education, it's training, it's understanding but maintaining the realization that the Army still remains here to fight our nation's wars.
And I would add, stepping back, we need to get better at lawfare. Without preempting Charlie Dunlap, who's going to talk later today, I love Appendix D of the new COIN FM because it really does capture this well. We have to get better at integrating law into military operations, not just having JAG officers serve as a check on the box in the MDMP, but truly integrating legal concerns into the planning of operations and even at the grand strategic level, the choice of which operations we want to pursue, grounding our strategic and operational and tactical decisions in the law, finding ways to leverage legitimacy, transparency, and accountability as sources of military power and political power and diplomatic power and so forth. This conceptual framework is one that everyone in this room embraces, but you're absolutely right. Very few green tabbers do so. And we have to get better at teaching and embracing our green tabbers, battlefield commanders for the uninitiated civilians in the room, so that law becomes a central component of American military power. And I think that we're moving in the right direction there. We have a lot of Renaissance men, if you will, men and women in positions of leadership. Colonel Paschal is one. Obviously, Dave Petraeus is another. And as these officers take the reins of the military, I think we're going to see this become a much more central part of the way that we fight and win our nation's wars.
If I could just add one more thing. Part of that is commander's intent. It was hard for me to it was hard for a young officer when I was articulating to him, if you're in a city council meeting or working with the police department, you stay in there even if there's a high-value target. Their initial sense is, well, I got to go out and do the kinetic operation. I said, no, you will stay there and execute that. One of the other things I think we could do, and the military is trying, is more assignments within the interagency, where we can take officers who are not going to be affected through their advancement and assign them to the State Department, to the Justice Department, and allow an education process to occur. And I think it would be just as important for those organizations to integrate with military forces when appropriate.
One of the things that we did as part of this whole developing this strategic action plan was when there was every quarter, General Petraeus convened a high-level meeting of all the senior commanders called the Command Assessment Synchronization Board to take a look at where we were in terms of progress on the Joint Campaign Plan. And initially, when this first started out to report on the rule of law, it started out as the Justice Department, as the rule of law coordinator, as the person giving this report. Phil and Ren Gady changed that so that they got up and they presented this as a partnership and jointly presented the issues and showed how the integration was working between the Rule of Law Coordinator's office, those elements at the PRTs that were working embedded with the military units. And I think this is important. It's important for the Iraqis to see how this interaction works and how this transition will eventually occur.
I believe, yes, ma'am.
Mr. Carter mentioned the SCRS, and I was wondering what each of you think about the role of the civilian response corps if it ultimately is absolutely funded and trained, whether you see them as a replacement to what the military is doing now and will follow on someone you will work in conjunction with, or if it is contractors and the likelihood of success.
Yes. I think right now you have to look at some of the stopgap measures in place and look at these folks as possibly filling those roles if they're able to mature the capabilities. So contractor personnel now make up a substantial part of most PRTs. You may see SCRS people moving into those positions if they can develop the capabilities in law, medicine, agriculture, etc. I think you may see some of the roles now being done by civil affairs officers migrate over to that community. And you may see a lot of detailed positions that the military is currently filling, gradually filled by those folks. It's just too soon to tell. I mean, you probably saw the post yesterday or today that they're advertising for a few hundred people to go to Afghanistan, and they're hoping to get a bunch of civilians to surge there with civilians. I'd like to see that effort go well. Unfortunately, SCRS doesn't have that massive military infrastructure we have for training, equipping, recruiting, and so forth. So it remains to be seen how well they're going to do at developing and recruiting and building this force to deploy them overseas.
I think it's critical, as Phil talked earlier, it doesn't matter who it is as long as your efforts are integrated and synchronized. One of my favorite employees on the provincial reconstruction team had no experience with the military. He was a Wall Street banker and thought, I want to go to Iraq, and he signed on as a contractor and worked in the provincial reconstruction team. But the expertise that he brought as we worked to try to stand up banking systems, and oftentimes what you'd see was shotgun patterns. We would fund CERT money for this, for that, and there was no long-term strategy. And what he brought and trained my folks, my leaders on, was value chains. And from start to finish, how do you spend your money wisely so it's going to last a long time and establish these systems in Iraq? So for me, it really doesn't matter who it is, but I think it's more important that we're synchronized and that we're working together and we could take advantage of each other's capabilities that we have to offer.
SCRS I think SCRS is inevitable, and it needs to be fully ramped up and with full infrastructure so that it can perform these tasks. And it's got a huge agenda, and it needs to have the support and resources that it deserves, because ultimately these are the guys who should be doing this sort of work. And that's Conflict Response Office, by the way, from down front.
What is SCRS? And I'm wondering if when you use your acronyms, people who aren't familiar with the PCPs and the QCRs, if you could try to remember them, sort of say what they are. What's SCRS?
It's the State Department's Civilian Reconstruction Office. I think I may have butchered.
Reconstruction and stabilization.
Thank you.
Yep, this was an office that was set up really to try to make the interagency process work. And my best friend at the National Defense University who worked on this, his favorite saying is the interagency is not a noun. It really doesn't exist. And all this thing about rice bowls, everybody's fighting over their territory all the time. State CRS, it was set up several years ago. It's had 2 different ambassadors in charge. The biggest problem is it never gets funded.
Yeah.
And it got a little bit of funding this last year to start to create some positions in the various executive branch agencies to start to fill in some of these different jobs. But it needs to be a much bigger effort. And one thing I think we forget so often, I know when I graduated from the Infantry Basic Course, back when Dave Crane and I were young and studly, I was handed my honor graduate award by John Paul Vann, a guy who had been an Army colonel who was a USAID guy in Vietnam. People forget that he commanded more ground combat forces than any Army general. Because there was an interagency process then, that was much more, frankly, mature and sophisticated than what we have today. This pulling apart within the government had just been horrific, and that's what hurts all of these efforts. State CRS is a good idea, a very small effort to try to bring some of this back. But again, back during Vietnam, and us old guys, we don't always want to talk about the old days, but we had an operation called Cords, which many of you may have heard of. Dick Stewart, who's an Army historian, has recently completed a 5-year study on how we made things work together in Vietnam. His conclusion of his study is that the operation was a success, but the patient died because of the security side that went away. But, we have PRTs today. We have problems filling positions. Under Cords, we had 8,000 Americans assigned. Many military, but also many civilians. Half of every new foreign service class, half of their graduates went immediately to Cords. We had an ambassador, Comer, who was deputy commander of MACD, who rated general office. So, this state CRS, this is a long-winded response, but they're an effort to try to bring some of this whole government process back in again. And we all agree it hasn't been very successful so far, but the day it starts to become successful is when some of this burden will be lifted from the military.
If I could just add to that, my name is Jan Jeffrey. I also work in the State Department I know here on the Holding State at the Civilian Response Board. There is some good news. Last week, Congress passed the FY9 omnibus, which included, I believe, $75 million to stand up a permanent civilian response corps. And as the speakers have mentioned, one of the most important things we need is a rapid response and the ability to coordinate a number of different U.S. government agencies and coordinate with donors and with the host country. And I'd just like to emphasize there are a lot of capabilities within the government. USAID has been doing development work for many decades. But coordinating all of this and planning for it in time is something that can help improve, and another really important thing that SCRS does as an organization working with agencies like INO and Justice and USAID and DoD.
I believe we have time for one more speaker or one more question, which I was going to reserve for Professor Nachbar.
I'm not sure that I deserve it. So it seems pretty clear from the whole panel, right, that there's a preference to have civilian leadership here. But Spence, I think you suggested something a little bit stronger, which is that there's sort of a fundamental inconsistency in having soldiers be part of what is the legal solution. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because the military has an awful lot of lawyers in it, and they seem to think that they're part of both a military and legal solution. And I didn't know if you really think it's that hopeless, or if we can go to lunch with some hope in our hearts.
Well, let me first say there is hope. And there's a lot of, this is the thing. There is a fundamental inconsistency that is apparent. And I go back to when I served in Bosnia, though, and it's a question about how the U.S. military has changed and what its work was. And when I was in Bosnia, the military were the liberators of Bosnia, and so there was amazing goodwill, and it wasn't perceived like that. And now, for better or for worse, 12 years later, we're looking at a Iraq where the common parlance is for the Americans is the occupiers, and we've gone to that. And I don't think it necessarily has to be that way. And I think a lot of the reasons why it is not that way is because good lawyers, good military lawyers, are doing good, smart work, and as I was saying, just building bona fides brick by brick, and this is what I think is necessary. I mean, the one thing that I would ask, and when I go back to things like what roles the military actually plays, whatever you do, I would suggest that it be done very well and be adequately resourced, and that's really the main thing. You look at things like the Regime Crime Liaison Office, or various different functions that were all sort of splayed out there, and I think that with a holistic approach, all things are possible, and the military can do a better job.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their insights and thoughts. And I have one administrative announcement. There's lunch in the back, but as you can see, we don't have tables available, so we ask that you go retrieve your food and return to your seat, and in about 20 minutes we'll have our lunch speaker. Thank you.